March 7th, 1985. County auction yard outside Webster City, Iowa. Cold morning, 38 degrees. Wind cutting through coats. Two farmers stood in the crowd waiting for the auction to start. They were neighbors. Farms bordered each other, but they couldn't have been more different. First farmer was David Morrison, age 37, owned 320 acres. Modest operation, worked alone mostly. Drove a 1976 Ford pickup with rust. Wore coveralls from Farm Supply. Looked like every other struggling farmer in Iowa. Second farmer was Richard Barrett, age 42. Owned 800 acres. Impressive operation. Employed 3 workers. Drove a 1984 Cadillac. Wore designer jeans and expensive jacket. Looked successful. Wanted everyone to know it. The auction started. Farm equipment from an estate sale. Old farmer had died. No heirs wanted the equipment. Everything had to go. Lot 47 came up. 1958. Farmall 460. Faded red paint, rusty fenders, cracked seat, 42,000 hours on it. Ancient by any standard. Auctioneer started bidding. Who'll give me 1,000 to start? Silence. Nobody wanted it. Okay. 500? More silence. 250 to get us going. David raised his hand. 100. Auctioneer pointed. Got 100. Do I hear 150? Silence. 100 going once, twice. Sold for $100. Richard Barrett laughed out loud, loud enough for everyone to hear. Morrison just bought a $100 piece of junk. That thing's not worth hauling away. People around them snickered. David felt his face burn but said nothing. Paid his $100, made arrangements to pick up the Farmall. But the Farmall wasn't the only thing David bought that day. He bought 3 more items, all old, all rejected by everyone else. Lot 52, 1963 Ford tractor. Wouldn't start. $50, Lot 68, old 2-bottom plow, rusty, $25. Lot 79, 1950s grain wagon. Rotted boards, $25. Total spent, $200. Richard watched David buy junk all morning. Finally walked over. Morrison, you're buying garbage. Why waste money on that trash? David looked at him calmly. Because it's what I can afford, and because I can fix it. Fix it? That stuff's beyond fixing. You're throwing money away. We'll see. Richard laughed again. I'll tell you what. In 5 years, come show me what that junk's worth. I bet you don't even have it anymore. You'll have scrapped it, or it'll be sitting in your field rusting. David met his eyes. I'll still have it, and it'll be working. I'll believe that when I see it. Richard walked away, shaking his head. Told his friends Morrison bought $400 in junk. Guy's clueless. The story spread through the community. Did you hear Morrison bought that old Farmall for $100? Barrett's right. That thing's worthless. David heard the talk. Ignored it. Brought the equipment home. Parked it behind his shed. Started working. The Farmall was first. David spent 3 weeks evaluating it. Engine had compression. Transmission shifted. Hydraulics worked. Electrically it was dead. Cosmetically it was ugly, but mechanically, solid. David created a plan. Replace all fluids, $48. Rewire electrical system, $32. New battery, $58. Carburetor rebuild kit, $24. New fuel filter, $8. Grease every fitting, $12 for grease. Clean fuel tank, free. DIY total investment, $182. Plus original $100 purchase, $282 total. David worked nights and weekends, drained fluids, pulled wiring harnesses, rebuilt carburetor, cleaned fuel system, greased every fitting, changed filters. Week 4, David turned the key, engine cranked, caught, ran rough. He adjusted carburetor, engine smoothed out, purred. The Farmall ran. 27-year-old tractor. Bought for $100, invested $182 in repairs. Total, $282, running perfectly. Next was the Ford tractor. Wouldn't start. David diagnosed it, seized engine. But he had a plan, found a used engine at salvage yard. $240, spent 2 weekends swapping engines. The Ford ran, total in Ford, 50 purchase plus 240 engine equals 290. The plow needed work. Blades were rusty but solid. Mold boards needed paint. Shares needed replacing. David found used shares, $40, painted it himself. $12 in paint, total in plow, 25 purchase plus 52 repairs equals 77. The wagon needed new boards. David found rough-cut lumber, $86. Built new bed himself. Total in wagon, 25 purchase plus 86 repairs equals 111. Grand total investment, Farmall, $282, Ford, $290, plow, $77, wagon, $111, total, $760. By August 1985, David owned 4 working pieces of equipment, bought for $200, invested $560 in repairs, total $760. He used them immediately. The Farmall pulled the plow, plowed 40 acres. The Ford pulled the wagon during harvest. The equipment worked. Richard Barrett saw David plowing one day, drove over in his Cadillac, watched, shook his head. "Morrison, you actually got that junk running?" "Yep, works fine." "Looks terrible though. Faded paint, rusty. Embarrassing to have that in your field." "It works, that's what matters." "Image matters too. Farmers judge you by your equipment. You look poor with that old stuff." "I am poor. Never pretended otherwise." Richard laughed. "At least you admit it. Hey, when you're ready to upgrade to real equipment, let me know. I've got connections at the dealer, can get you financed." "Don't want financing. What I have works." "Suit yourself, but don't come crying when that junk breaks down and you can't afford repairs." Richard drove away. David kept plowing. Meanwhile, Richard was living differently. His 800 acres were impressive. Modern equipment everywhere. 3 John Deere tractors, 2 combines, new planter, everything latest models. But Richard had debt, lots of debt. Equipment loans, $340,000. Land mortgage, $460,000. Operating line of credit, $92,000. Total debt, $892,000. Annual debt service at 14% average, $124,000 annually. Richard needed to gross $400,000 just to cover debt service and operating costs. Required perfect crops, perfect prices, perfect weather. David had no debt, zero. Owned his 320 acres free and clear, inherited from his father. Equipment was paid for, $760 total invested. Annual operating costs, $42,000 for seed, fertilizer, fuel, maintenance. David needed to gross maybe $90,000 to cover costs and live modestly. Much lower threshold. 1985 was decent year. Both farmers did okay, but storm clouds were gathering. Farm crisis was starting. 1986 hit hard. Crop prices dropped. Corn went from $320 to $240. Soybeans from $710 to $560. 25% price decline. Richard's 800 acres grossed $312,000, down from $420,000 previous year. Operating costs stayed at $180. Debt service stayed at $124. Total obligations, $304. Richard netted $8,000. Barely survived. David's 320 acres grossed $122,000, down from $168,000 previous year. Operating costs stayed at $42. No debt service. Total obligations, $42. David netted $80,000. Comfortable. The difference was debt. Richard was leveraged. David wasn't. Same price drop. Completely different outcomes. 1987 was worse. Prices dropped more. Richard had negative cash flow. Had to borrow from operating line to make debt payments. By 1988, Richard was in trouble. Behind on payments. Bank was pressuring him. He needed help. David kept farming quietly, used his old equipment, lived cheap, saved money, no drama. One day in March 1988, Richard knocked on David's door. "Morrison, I need a favor." David waited. "I'm short on cash. Need about 10,000 to make payment. Can you loan it to me? I'll pay you back at harvest." David considered. "You sure you can pay back?" "Absolutely. Just temporary cash flow problem. Harvest will fix everything." David loaned him 10,000, took a note. Richard promised to repay with interest at harvest. Harvest came. Richard didn't repay, avoided David, made excuses. David wrote it off mentally. 10,000 lesson learned. Never loan money to Richard. 1989 brought another request. Richard needed 20,000. David said no. Richard got angry. "I thought we were neighbors. Neighbors help each other. I helped last time. You didn't pay me back. I will this time, I promise." "No, figure it out yourself." Richard stormed off, told people David was selfish. "Morrison's got money but won't help his neighbor. What kind of person does that?" The irony was rich. Richard had spent years mocking David's poverty. Now accused David of being selfish with money. Through the 90s, the pattern continued. Richard struggled. Equipment broke down. Couldn't afford repairs. Fields looked rough. Yields declined. David prospered quietly. His old equipment kept running. He maintained it religiously. Spent money on preventive maintenance. Nothing ever broke catastrophically. His Farmall 460 logged 12,000 hours between 85 and 95. 10 years. Original $100 purchase. 200 in maintenance over 10 years. $20 annually for a working tractor. Richard spent 80,000 on tractor payments in those same 10 years, plus maintenance, plus insurance, plus depreciation. His tractors cost him 12,000 per year each. He had 36,000 annually in tractor costs. David, $20 per year. Richard, 36,000 per year. David was spending less than 1% of what Richard spent on tractors. Both farming, both getting crops in, the savings accumulated. David saved approximately 60,000 annually through the 90s. 10 years, 600,000 accumulated. Richard went deeper in debt. By 1995, owed 940,000, more than when he started. 1996 brought personal disaster for Richard. His wife divorced him, cited financial stress, took half of everything in settlement. Richard had to sell 200 acres to pay her. Now he farmed 600 acres with same debt load. Math became impossible. 1997, Richard missed payment. Bank started foreclosure proceedings. Richard panicked, tried to sell. But nobody wanted to buy a failing farm with massive debt. Couldn't get what he needed. By 1999, Richard was desperate. Foreclosure was 60 days away. He had one option left. March 12th, 2000. Exactly 15 years after the auction, where he'd mocked David's $400 junk purchase. Richard drove his Cadillac, now 11 years old, paint fading, interior torn, to David's farm. Parked outside the modest farmhouse, knocked. David answered, looked at Richard, saw desperation in his eyes. "Morrison, can we talk?" "Sure, come in." They sat at David's kitchen table. Richard looked around. House was same as always, nothing fancy, nothing updated, just functional. Richard swallowed his pride, started talking. "I'm losing the farm. Bank's foreclosing in 60 days. I've tried everything, can't save it. I'm going to lose everything my father built, everything I worked for." David listened silently. "I know we haven't always gotten along. I know I mocked you. 15 years ago at that auction, I laughed at you buying that old Farmall, called it junk, said you were wasting money." David remembered, said nothing. "I was wrong. You bought that tractor for $100, fixed it yourself. It's still running. I've seen it. You're still using it." David nodded. "Yep, still runs fine. I spent $340,000 on tractors, financed, paid interest, depreciated. Now they're being repossessed. You spent $100. Still have a working tractor. You were smarter than me. David didn't gloat, just listened. I need your help, I'm begging. The farm's being foreclosed, 600 acres. Bank will auction it, probably get 800 per acre. 480,000. I owe 940,000. I'll still owe 460 after they take everything. Richard's voice cracked. Unless someone buys it privately before auction, pays enough to clear the debt, then I walk away clean, start over. David saw where this was going. You want me to buy your farm? Yes, I'm begging you. Buy it. Pay off my debt. Let me walk away. I'll work for you if you want. I'll do anything. Just please, don't let me lose everything and still owe 500,000. David sat quietly, thinking. Richard had mocked him for 15 years, called his equipment junk, called him poor, laughed at his choices, refused to pay back the 10,000 loan. Now Richard was begging David to save him. David could refuse. Watch Richard lose everything would be justified. Richard had been cruel, but David wasn't cruel. He was practical. What's the farm worth? Bank appraisal says 900,000. 600 acres at 1,500 per acre. What do you owe? 940,000 total. So you're underwater 40,000. Yes. David thought about it. 600 acres at 900,000 was decent price. He had the money, had saved aggressively. Currently had 1,2 million in liquid savings, plus his own farm. He could buy Richard's farm. Would own 920 acres total. Good size operation. I'll buy it, but not for 900,000. I'll pay 800,000. That's 1333 per acre. Fair market in current conditions. Richard's face fell. But I owe 940. If you only pay 800, I still owe 140. Not my problem. That's my offer. 800,000. Take it or leave it. Richard felt trapped. 800,000 left him with 140,000 debt, but foreclosure would leave him with 460,000 debt. 800 was better than auction. Can you do 850? That leaves me 90,000 in debt. I can maybe work that off in a few years. David considered. 850,000. Final offer, but only if you pay me back the 10,000 you owe me from 88, with interest. At 10% over 12 years, that's 31,000 total. Richard's jaw dropped. You're including that old debt? You borrowed it. Never paid it back. It's still owed. But that would leave me with 121,000 in debt after sale. Better than 460 after foreclosure. Take it or don't. Your choice. Richard had no choice. Okay, 850. I'll pay back the 31. Thank you. You're saving my life. I'm buying a farm at good price. You're settling debts. That's business, not charity. They closed in 42 days. David paid 850,000. Bank got 850. Richard walked away owing 121,000 to various creditors, including David. But Richard was free of the farm, could start over, get a job, work his way back. David now owned 920 acres, his 320 original, plus Richard's 600, almost tripled his operation. The irony was complete. 15 years earlier, Richard had mocked David's $400 equipment purchase. Now, Richard had lost everything, while David owned nearly 1,000 acres. The community noticed. Did you hear Morrison bought Barrett's farm? Barrett's the one who always mocked Morrison. Now Morrison owns Barrett's land. Some said David was mercenary. He profited from Barrett's misery. Others said Richard got what he deserved. Barrett was arrogant for years, mocked Morrison constantly. Karma caught up. David didn't care about opinions. He'd bought land at fair price, helped Richard avoid total catastrophe. That was enough. Richard moved to town, got job managing a grain elevator, made 48,000 annually, lived cheap, paid down his debts over 7 years. By 2007 was debt-free again. In 2008, Richard did something unexpected. Drove out to David's farm, knocked on door. David answered. Richard, what brings you here? I wanted to thank you properly. For what? For buying the farm in 2000, you saved me from complete destruction. If bank had foreclosed, I'd have owed 460,000, would have bankrupted me, ruined my life completely. You paid 850. I got fair deal. You got great deal. Farm's worth 1.4 million now. You made 550,000 appreciation in 8 years. But that's fine. You deserved it. You were smart with money. I wasn't. David nodded. Richard continued. I spent 15 years mocking you, your old equipment, your modest lifestyle, your unwillingness to spend money. I thought you were poor and foolish. Turned out you were rich and wise. I was the fool. You weren't a fool. You just made different choices, valued different things. I valued image over substance, borrowed to look successful while you saved to be successful. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. They talked for an hour. Richard apologized for years of mockery, admitted his mistakes, thanked David for the rescue. David accepted gracefully, didn't gloat, didn't lecture, just accepted. Richard left. They weren't friends exactly, but the animosity was gone. Understanding replaced it. David continued farming until 2015. Age 67, decided to retire, sold the operation, 920 acres at current prices, 3.6 million. Equipment, 400,000. Total sale, 4 million, plus his accumulated savings, 1.8 million. Total net worth at retirement, 5.8 million. David Morrison, the farmer who bought $400 in junk at auction. The farmer his rich neighbor mocked for 15 years, retired with nearly $6 million. Richard Barrett, the rich neighbor who mocked him, lost everything, had to beg David to buy his farm, worked as grain elevator manager for 15 years. At David's retirement auction in 2015, Richard attended, watched David's old Farmall sell, the 1958 Farmall 460, bought for $100 in 1985, used for 30 years, still running, still working. It sold for $12,000 to a collector who wanted working vintage equipment. Richard watched the bidding, shook his head. He bought that for $100, used it 30 years, sold it for $12,000. Made $11,900 profit, plus 30 years of free labor. I spent hundreds of thousands on tractors, got nothing. He spent $100, got everything. David saw Richard watching, walked over. That old Farmall lasted longer than either of us expected. Richard smiled sadly. You were right. I was wrong. About everything, the equipment, the debt, the lifestyle, all of it. You built wealth quietly while I went broke loudly. Different paths, different results. That's all. Can I ask you something? Sure. When I begged you to buy the farm in 2000, why did you do it? I'd been terrible to you for 15 years. You could have refused, watched me crash, would have been justified. David thought about it. Because it was good business. 600 acres at $850 was fair price. Plus, you needed help. I could provide it. Why wouldn't I? Most people would have wanted revenge. Revenge doesn't build wealth. Smart purchases do. I bought your farm because it made financial sense. Your suffering wasn't the point. Richard understood. David had never been motivated by emotion, only by logic. Buy low, maintain well, sell high. Simple formula. That formula turned $400 at auction into $6 million at retirement. Richard learned the lesson too late to help himself, but he taught his children. Never mock someone for living below their means. Never assume debt equals success. Never confuse appearance with reality. Your Uncle David proved all of that. Learn from him. Don't repeat my mistakes. The story spread through farming communities. The rich neighbor who mocked the poor neighbor's $400 equipment. 15 years later, begged him to buy his farm. Classic tale of pride before fall. Business schools studied it. Harvard Business Review wrote case study, Pride, Debt and Consequences, the Morrison-Barrett Farm Acquisition. The case examined Richard's leverage strategy versus David's conservative approach. Same market, same time period, completely opposite results. MBA students debated. Was Morrison's approach replicable, or was he just lucky? Answer: totally replicable. Buy assets cheap, maintain them well, avoid debt, save aggressively, build wealth slowly. Nothing lucky about it, just discipline. Was Barrett's failure inevitable, or could he have recovered? Answer: not inevitable, but probable. High leverage plus price volatility equals high failure risk. Barrett was statistically likely to fail eventually. The Farmall became symbol. Photo of David's $100 tractor appeared in textbooks. Caption: asset purchased for $100 in 1985. Used 30 years. Sold for $12,000 in 2015. Total return 11,900% plus 30 years of utility. Compared to modern tractor purchased for $85,000 in 1985. Financed at 14% interest. Total payments $156,000 over 10 years. Sold for $22,000 in 1995. Total loss $134,000. The numbers told the story. David's approach won. Richard's approach failed. Math doesn't lie. David Morrison died in 2021 at age 73, left estate worth $6.4 million to his children. The $6 million from farm sale had grown through conservative investing. His funeral was attended by hundreds. Richard was there, gave a eulogy. David Morrison taught me the hardest lesson I ever learned. Success isn't about looking rich. It's about being rich. David looked poor, drove old trucks, wore cheap clothes, used old equipment. Everyone thought he was struggling. He was actually thriving. I looked rich, drove Cadillac, wore designer clothes, used new equipment. Everyone thought I was successful. I was actually failing. The difference: David saved, I spent, David owned, I borrowed, David built, I pretended. 15 years after I mocked his $400 equipment purchase, I was begging him to save me from foreclosure. The irony still burns, but I deserved it. I was arrogant, cruel, wrong. David saved me anyway, not out of charity, out of business sense. He bought my farm at fair price, made money on it, as he should have. I owe him everything. He gave me chance to start over, taught me humility through experience, showed me real wealth comes from discipline, not display. Rest well, David. You won at everything. The only thing you lost was time wasted tolerating my mockery. I'm sorry for that. Thank you for the lesson. Thank you for the rescue. Thank you for the example. The rich neighbor who mocked your $400 Farmall learned his lesson. Too late for me, but not too late for others. Your example lives on. Discipline beats debt. Substance beats image. Quiet wealth beats loud poverty. You proved it. I learned it. The world should remember it. Standing ovation. 5 minutes, everyone crying. The poor farmer who looked rich, the rich farmer who looked poor, the 15-year lesson, the complete reversal. The story lives forever. The rich neighbor mocked the $400 Farmall. 15 years later, begged to sell his farm, lost everything, while the mocked neighbor retired a multimillionaire. That's the power of mocking what you don't understand, of assuming debt equals success, of confusing image with reality. Richard learned. The world learned. The lesson continues. Never mock someone's choices until you see their results. David's $400 equipment purchase started a 30-year journey to $6 million. Richard's $340,000 in tractor debt started a 15-year journey to foreclosure. The Farmall outlasted everything, bought for $100, used for 30 years, sold for $12,000, still running when David retired. Richard's tractors? Repossessed, gone. Wasted money. The lesson is clear, simple, undeniable. Mocking someone's frugality while drowning in debt is peak irony. Richard lived it. David proved it. The story teaches it forever. The rich neighbor mocked the poor neighbor. 15 years later, begged him for help. That's pride. That's karma. That's what happens when image matters more than substance. David Morrison. The man with the $400 Farmall, $6 million retirement, quiet winner, Richard Barrett. The man with the Cadillac and mockery, foreclosure and bankruptcy, loud loser. Same community, same time period, different choices, different results, lesson learned, forever told. The $400 Farmall that shut up the rich neighbor. That's power, that's proof, that's the story. The 15 years year by year contrast. To truly understand how David's $400 purchase led to millions, while Richard's hundreds of thousands led to bankruptcy, you need to see the year-by-year details. Year 1, 1985. David's situation. 320 acres owned free and clear. 4 pieces of equipment. Total investment $760. Annual operating costs $42,000. Gross income $168,000. Net income $126,000. Living expenses $28,000. Saved $98,000. Richard's situation. 800 acres with $460 debt. Modern fleet, total debt $340 on equipment. Annual. Operating costs $180,000, debt service $124,000, gross income $420,000, net after costs and debt $116,000, living expenses $92,000, expensive lifestyle, saved $24,000. Both had good year, but David saved 4 times as much despite earning far less. Why? No debt service. Low living expenses. Year 2, 1986. Prices started dropping. Corn from $320 to $280. Soybeans from $710 to $640. David's situation. Gross income dropped to $144,000. Operating costs stayed at $42,000. No debt service. Net $102,000. Living expenses $28,000. Saved $74,000. Richard's situation. Gross income dropped to $360,000. Operating costs stayed at $180. Debt service stayed at $124. Net after costs and debt $56,000. Living expenses still $92,000. Couldn't cut lifestyle. Deficit $36,000. Had to borrow from credit line. First year, Richard went backwards. Borrowed $36,000 to maintain lifestyle, while David saved $74,000. Year 3, 1987. Crisis deepened. Corn dropped to $240, soybeans to $560. David's situation. Gross income $122,000. Operating costs $42,000. Net $80,000. Living expenses $28,000. Saved $52,000. Richard's situation. Gross income $312,000. Operating costs $180. Debt service $124. Net $8,000. Living expenses needed $92. Deficit $84,000. Borrowed from credit line. Richard's credit line went from $92,000 to $176,000 in 1 year. Spiraling. Year 4, 1988. This was the year Richard asked David for $10,000 loan. Prices stayed low. David's situation. Gross $118,000. Costs $42,000. Net $76,000. Living $28,000. Saved $48,000. Loaned. Richard $10,000. Net saved $38,000. Richard's situation. Gross $308,000. Costs $180. Debt service $124. Net $4,000. Living $92. Deficit $88,000. Borrowed from credit line $78,000. David's 10 covered part of it. Credit line balance $254,000, up from $176. Richard was drowning, adding $78,000 debt annually. Unsustainable. Year 5, 1989. David's situation. Gross $126,000. Slight price recovery. Costs $42,000. Net $84,000. Living $28,000. Saved $56,000. Total accumulated savings $324,000. 5 years. Richard's situation. Gross $322,000. Costs 180, debt service 124, net 18,000, living 92, deficit 74,000, credit line balance 328,000. Richard asked David for 20,000. David refused. Richard had to find money elsewhere, borrowed from relatives. Years 6 through 10, 90 through 94. Prices stabilized somewhat. Not good, but not catastrophic. David's pattern: annual gross averaging 132,000, costs steady at 42,000, net averaging 90,000, living steady at 28,000, annual savings averaging 62,000, 5-year total savings 310,000, accumulated total by 94, 634,000. Richard's pattern: annual gross averaging 336,000, costs steady at 180, debt service steady at 124, net averaging 32,000, living at 92, annual deficit averaging 60,000, 5-year added debt 300,000, credit line balance by 94, 628,000, plus equipment loans stayed at 340, plus land debt stayed at 460, total debt by 94, 1,428,000. Richard owed more in 94 than in 85, despite farming for 9 years. Years 11 through 15, 95 through 99. These were the catastrophe years for Richard. 95. Divorce. Wife took 200 acres in settlement, had to sell them, got 240, 1,200 per acre. After paying her lawyer and costs, cleared 190, used it to pay down credit line to 438,000. But now farming 600 acres instead of 800, income dropped proportionally. Gross 252,000, 600 acres, costs 140, reduced with less ground. Debt service 124, same debt, less income. Net negative 12,000. Had to borrow 12,000 just to cover debt service, 96 through 99. Death spiral. Richard couldn't generate enough income from 600 acres to cover debt service, borrowed annually from credit line. Balance grew. By 99. Credit line 586,000, equipment loans 340,000, land debt 460,000, originally on 800 acres, now on 600, total 1,386,000, then bank called loan, wanted repayment. Richard couldn't pay. Foreclosure started. Meanwhile, David 95 through 99. Annual gross averaging 140,000, costs at 42,000, net averaging 98,000, living at 28,000, annual savings averaging 70,000, 5-year savings 350, total accumulated by 99, 984,000. David had saved nearly 1 million in 15 years. Richard had added 500,000 in debt in 15 years. The equipment story, old versus new. The philosophical difference between David and Richard showed clearest in equipment philosophy. David's Farmall 460, bought for $100, purchased March 1985 for $100. Repairs year 1, 182. Annual maintenance average, $20. Oil, grease, filters. Major repair year 8. New clutch, $480. Major repair year 13. Hydraulic pump, $320. Total invested over 15 years, $1,482. Hours logged, 12,000 hours. 800 annually average. Cost per hour, 12 cents. Still running in year 15. Sold at retirement for 12,000. Total cost of ownership, 1,482. Revenue at sale, 12,000. Net profit, $10,518 plus 15 years of use. Richard's primary tractor, John Deere 4050. Purchased 1984 for 85,000, financed. Interest over 10-year loan at 14%, 64,000. Total payments, $149,000, insurance 10 years, $12,000 annual maintenance, $2,800 average dealer service. 10-year maintenance, $28,000, total invested over 10 years, $189,000, hours logged, 9,000 hours. 900 annually average, cost per hour, $21, repossessed year 11, zero value recovered. Total cost, $189,000. Revenue, zero. Net loss, $189,000. Multiplied across Richard's 3 tractors, $567,000 net loss on tractors alone over 15 years. David's approach, buy cheap, maintain well, use forever, profit. Richard's approach, buy expensive, finance, lose everything. The community perspective. 15 years of judgment. The community watched both farmers for 15 years. Opinions varied. 85 through 89. Morrison's struggling. Look at his old equipment. Barrett's doing great. New equipment everywhere. 90 through 94. Morrison seems okay. Barrett's spending a lot. Hope he knows what he's doing. 95 through 99. Barrett's in trouble. Divorce. Selling land. Morrison's still farming, same as always. In 2000, Barrett lost everything. Morrison bought his farm. Unbelievable turnaround. The reversal shocked people. How did the poor farmer end up rich while rich farmer ended up poor? Answer was visible entire time, but people judged by appearance, ignored fundamentals. David looked poor, was building wealth. Richard looked rich, was building debt. Appearances deceived everyone. Coffee shop conversations shifted over 15 years. 85. Poor Morrison buying that junk equipment. He'll never make it looking that poor. 90. Morrison still farming same ground, same old equipment. Crazy. 95. Did you hear Barrett's divorcing and Morrison loaned him money years ago that he never got back? 2000. Morrison bought Barrett's farm, the guy Barrett mocked for 15 years. That's karma. The narrative went from pity to curiosity to shock to respect. By 2005, community view of David had completely changed. Morrison's one of the smartest farmers we've ever seen. Looked poor but built fortune. Never borrowed, never failed, just kept working. Respect replaced mockery. Understanding replaced judgment. The family impact. Children learned different lessons. David had 2 children, son and daughter. They watched their father farm for 30 years. What they learned: live below your means always. Buy assets that generate value. Avoid debt completely. Maintain what you own meticulously. Ignore others' opinions about your choices. Save aggressively. Build wealth slowly. Don't confuse appearance with reality. David's son became engineer, earned well, saved aggressively, retired at 52 with $2 million, followed father's principles. David's daughter became teacher, modest income, but saved half of it. Retired at 60 with $1 million, followed father's example. Both children thanked their father. You showed us wealth comes from discipline, not income. We applied your lessons, built financial independence. Thank you. Richard had 3 children. They watched their father for 30 years too. What they learned: debt is dangerous, image doesn't equal success, pride leads to fall, respect others regardless of appearance, financial failure can destroy families, humility matters. Richard's children learned through negative example. What not to do. Eldest son became accountant, extremely conservative with money, never borrowed anything. I watched Dad lose everything through debt. I'll never make that mistake. Middle daughter became financial planner, specialized in helping people avoid debt. My father's failure taught me to help others not repeat it. Youngest son struggled, repeated some of father's mistakes, borrowed heavily, failed, then learned, started over, applied lessons hard way. Richard's grandchildren received the lessons too. Your grandfather lost everything. Don't be like him. Be like David Morrison. He built wealth quietly while your grandfather went broke loudly. The generational impact extended far. David's example taught his family wealth building. Richard's failure taught his family debt avoidance, both valuable lessons. One from positive example, one from negative, both effective. The mathematical truth: why David won: strip away emotion, remove judgment, look only at math. David's formula: income minus costs minus savings equals living expenses. Living expenses were dependent variable. Savings came first. Lived on whatever remained. Richard's formula: income minus costs minus living expenses equals savings. Savings were dependent variable. Living expenses came first. Saved whatever remained, usually nothing. David: pay yourself first. Live on rest. Richard: live first. Save rest. David's approach forced frugality. Richard's approach enabled spending. Compound this over 15 years. David saved $984,000, invested conservatively at 7%. Grew to $1,400,000 by 2000. Richard saved nothing, added $500,000 debt. Interest at 14% compounded against him. Ended $1,400,000 in hole. $2,800,000 gap, created by different formulas applied to similar situations. Math doesn't care about pride, image, opinions. Just numbers. David's numbers worked. Richard's didn't. That's all. The auction moment that started everything, March 7th, 1985. The day Richard mocked David's purchase. The day everything started. If you could go back to that moment with knowledge of next 15 years, what would you see? You'd see David bid $100 on Farmall, future $6 million farmer buying foundation asset. You'd see Richard laugh at him, future foreclosure victim mocking future success. You'd see crowd snicker, future gossips judging future winner. The irony was complete from day one. They just didn't know it yet. That $100 purchase represented philosophy. Buy assets cheap, make them work, build value. Richard's $340,000 in tractor debt represented opposite philosophy. Borrow for image, pay forever, build nothing. The auction was the beginning, two paths diverging. 15 years to play out, inevitable conclusion, the rescue moment that ended everything, March 12th, 2000. 15 years later, Richard begging David to buy his farm. The irony must have burned Richard. The man he'd mocked for 15 years was his only hope. David could have said no, would have been justified. Richard had been cruel, mocking, arrogant, never paid back the $10,000 loan. David owed Richard nothing, but David said yes, not from kindness, from opportunity. 600 acres at $850,000, good deal. Market value was $900,000, $1,333 per acre versus $1,500, 14% discount, plus satisfaction of buying from the man who'd mocked him. Not revenge, just irony appreciated. Richard walked away owing $121,000, but alive financially, could rebuild. Without David's purchase, Richard would have owed $460,000 after foreclosure. Bankruptcy would have followed, credit destroyed, life ruined. David's purchase saved Richard from absolute catastrophe. Richard was grateful, should have been. The retirement moment that proved everything, 2015. David retired. 30 years after buying the Farmall for $100, auction day, equipment sale, hundreds attended. The Farmall 460 came up, lot 47, same lot number as 85 auction. Auctioneer told the story. This tractor was purchased at this very auction 30 years ago for $100. Farmer named Richard Barrett mocked the buyer, said it was junk. 15 years later, Barrett lost his farm. Buyer saved him. That buyer is retiring today. The tractor still runs. 30 years old when he bought it, 60 years old now, still working. Bidding started at 5,000. Collectors wanted it. Story made it valuable. 5,000, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000. Sold for 12,000. Buyer was collector from Minnesota. I want this tractor because it represents something. Buying right, maintaining well, using fully, building value. That's good farming. That's good business. That's good life. The Farmall left on trailer. 60-year-old tractor still running. Sold for 12,000. Bought for 100. Used for 30 years. Profit of 11,900 plus 3 decades of utility. Richard watched it sell. Tears in eyes. That tractor outlasted my marriage, my farm, my equipment, my success, all because David maintained it and I didn't maintain my finances. The contrast was complete, the lesson undeniable, the proof absolute. 30 years from mockery to mastery, from laughter to loss, from poor to rich, from rich to poor. David Morrison, the $400 equipment buyer, $6 million retiree. Richard Barrett, the mocker, the loser, the cautionary tale. The legacy that continues. David Morrison's story spread far beyond Webster City, became teaching tool, business case, life lesson. Financial planners use it. Don't judge others' financial choices. David looked poor, was building millions. Richard looked rich, was building debt. Agricultural consultants use it. Match equipment to need, not image. David's $100 tractor worked as well as Richard's $85,000 tractor. One cost 1/10% as much. Family counselors use it. Pride and mockery destroy relationships. Richard mocked David for 15 years, ended up begging him for help. Humility would have served him better. Debt counselors use it. Leverage amplifies everything. Good times and bad. Richard's debt magnified his losses. David's debt-free status protected him. The principles are universal. 1. Never mock someone's financial choices based on appearance. 2. Debt is risk. More debt equals more risk. Eventually, risk catches you. 3. Living below your means builds wealth. Living at your means builds nothing. Living above your means builds debt. 4. Maintenance matters more than model. Old equipment maintained well outperforms new equipment maintained poorly. 5. Pride comes before fall, always, without exception. 6. 15 years is enough time for truth to emerge. David's strategy took time to prove itself, but it did. 7. Karma is real. Richard mocked David. 15 years later, begged him for help. The universe notices. 8. Image is worthless. Substance is everything. David looked poor, but was rich. Richard looked rich, but was poor. Reality won. 9. One decision can start everything. David's $100 purchase started 30-year wealth-building journey. Richard's mocking started 15-year descent to bankruptcy. 10. Helping others when they've wronged you is ultimate power. David bought Richard's farm despite years of mockery. That's strength. David Morrison proved all 10 principles, lived them, demonstrated them, left them as legacy. The final word. At David's funeral in 2021, Richard gave the eulogy. He ended with this. David Morrison bought a tractor for $100 in 1985. I laughed at him, mocked him, called him poor and stupid, told everyone his purchase was junk. 30 years later, that tractor sold for $12,000. Still running, still working, still valuable. I bought tractors for $340,000, financed them, paid interest, lost them all to repossession, got zero value back. David's $100 purchase returned $12,000 plus 30 years of use. My $340,000 purchases returned zero plus, destroyed my finances. The math is simple. The lesson is clear. I was the fool. David was the genius. But David never said, I told you so. Never gloated. Never reminded me of my mockery. Just bought my farm when I begged him. Gave me chance to start over. Treated me with dignity I didn't deserve. That's who David Morrison was. Smart enough to buy right. Humble enough to ignore mockery. Strong enough to help his mocker when the time came. I owe him everything. My restart, my second chance, my financial recovery, all because he rose above my pettiness. The rich neighbor mocked the poor neighbor's $400 equipment. 15 years later, begged him to buy his farm. That's my story, my shame, my lesson. But it's also my gratitude. David could have refused, could have watched me burn. Instead, he helped. That's grace. Rest well, David. You won at everything, farming, finance, life. You beat me in every way, but you never rubbed it in, that's class. Thank you for the lesson. Thank you for the mercy. Thank you for the example. The world is poorer without you, but richer for having known you. The $400 Farmall lasted 30 years. Your legacy will last forever. Standing ovation. 10 minutes, longest in that church's history. The poor farmer who became rich, the rich farmer who became poor. The lesson learned, the grace given. David Morrison, March 1948 to November 2021. 73 years, 30 years farming, 6 million accumulated. All starting with $400 in junk equipment one rich neighbor mocked. The mocker learned. The lesson lives, the story continues. Never mock frugality while drowning in debt. Never judge poverty by appearance. Never assume image equals success. David proved it. Richard learned it. The world remembers it. $400 to 6 million. Mockery to mercy. Pride to humility. 15 years to reversal. That's the story. That's the truth. That's the power of buying a $100 Farmall while your rich neighbor laughs. Then buying his farm 15 years later when he begs you to save him. Justice, karma, math, all working together, perfectly demonstrated, forever remembered. The rich neighbor mocked the $400 Farmall. 15 years later begged to sell his farm, lost everything. The mocked neighbor retired with millions. That's how it ended. That's why it matters. That's the lesson that lives forever.